Good to see you again. If you were with me the last time we met, you heard me talking about life in America in the late 19th century. At the beginning of that lecture, I described life in the United States as a collection of island communities where people did a lot for themselves. Individualism was a philosophy that a lot of people put a lot of stock into. The idea that you were responsible for your own lot in life, and if you worked hard, you would be rewarded with material success in this lifetime. You also probably heard me talk quite a bit about this changing economy, in particular the industrialization of the American economy, and how this was really going to change life in America, especially when it comes to these island communities, these towns. And that's what I want to talk about here today, the industrialization of the United States, which is also occurring in the late 19th century. There's a lot of explanations as to why we're seeing such rapid and dramatic changes in the economy. I'm going to focus on a few of them. Part of this is the Civil War, the fact that we needed an enormous amount of weapons and food and uniforms and boots, and you could go right down the list. This is going to usher in this process of mass production, right? The idea of producing on a massive, unprecedented scale. That's something that's brought about by the American Civil War. But what these producers are going to quickly realize is that is going to have direct benefits in the post-war period as well. You're going to see every aspect of the American economy really beginning to explode in the late 19th century. And there's probably an even more specific reason as to why. That's both related to the Civil War and also something that's unrelated at the same time. There is a driver in this American economy, and I'll say pun intended on this. That driver of the American economy would be the railroad, right? It's the railroads, and this is worth writing down. The railroads are going to cause every other industry in the United States to explode. And again, there's a very simple reason as to why. Think about what you need to build a railroad. Think about what you need to build a railroad. You need steel. And in 1862, the U.S. government is going to introduce something called the Railroad Acts. And this is not just one, but numerous initiatives all across the United States, really North America. And the result of this is going to be hundreds of thousands of miles of railroad tracks that will be laid. Well, if you're Andrew Carnegie, somebody's got to make that steel. And if you understand that we're laying hundreds of thousands of miles of railroad tracks, and Carnegie just so happens to be in the steel business, you'll understand very, very quickly why he's going to become one of the richest men in the world so very quickly. By 1869, we will have traversed the American continent with the Transcontinental Railroad. Think about all the steel, all the timber, all the coal, all the oil, all the raw materials that go into creating a railroad, right? Think about the people who are financing all of this. These are Eastern bankers, people like J.P. Morgan. They're putting up the money. They're not doing it out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing it to make money on their investment. Think about the people that are going to build this railroad. We're not talking about middle-class people that live in what you and I call the suburbs. We're talking about immigrants, people that are coming from places like Ireland and Italy, people that are coming from places like China, people that are coming from places like Mexico. It's a predominantly immigrant workforce that is going to build the railroads, without which we probably wouldn't have a railroad, right? But once they're now in the United States, immigrants themselves are going to create a demand. They need food, and they need tools, and they need clothing, and they need entertainment and housing, and the list goes on and on. And so if you think about the railroad is very much central in the industrialization of the United States. This is happening in the late 19th century at the same time that the railroad is really beginning to take off. And when it takes off, it's causing every other element of the American economy to boom. Is this a good thing? Yes. Yes, it's a good thing. It's a good thing because it unequivocally raises the standard of living in the United States. What I mean is, you can now go into places like California and you can get what before the railroad came to town would have been not only a very great delicacy, but something that was almost completely unheard of back in the East. Citrus fruits, various nut crops, all kinds of things that people just simply did not have access to. It will be a boon in the economy in places like Texas. Before 1877, cattle ranching was not a great business to go into, primarily because there was no viable way to get your cattle to market. After 1877, when the Missouri Central Railroad hooked Fort Worth up with the rest of the national economy, all of a sudden cattle ranching exploded as an economic venture, primarily because now they had the means to market their products. And so these are good things, but there are a downside to this as well. And what it means is that now your smaller mom and pop producers all of a sudden are going to have to compete with the big boys, right? The massive producers that are based in places like Chicago and New York, St. Louis, but they didn't have access to some of those more rural, some of those Western markets. And certainly that'll change with the railroad. And as you can probably see where I'm going with this is going to put some of your smaller producers out of business. It's going to create that level of cutthroat competition that is going to make survival very, very difficult for your smaller producers, which actually has even more consequences, unanticipated consequences maybe, that we'll talk about even later in this lecture. But for right now, understand that the creation of the railroad is more or less a double-edged sword, and it cuts both ways. It's good and it's bad at the same time. For right now, I want to talk about how this process of industrialization is affecting all realms of the economy, north, south, east, and west. Most history books are really going to ascribe the process of industrialization primarily as a northern phenomenon, and certainly that's the case. You do see industrialization completely and entirely reshape Chicago. Certainly, industrialization was very, very important in places like New York and even places like San Francisco, but it's going to reach into the South as well. It's going to reshape a Southern economy. Stop for just a second and think about this. The South's economy before the Civil War was defined by one industry, and that was agriculture. And even by the standards of agriculture, it was primarily defined by the institution that was cotton, right? The South's economy was a one-trick pony. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, there's a lot of people, primarily businessmen in the North, that are looking at the South and saying there's an enormous amount of untapped potential there in the South, and we aim to really harness that potential. This concept of making the South live up to its potential comes to be known as the New South. But really what I need you to understand about the New South is the industrial South, right? We will see industrialization at least attempted to be brought to the American South. Steel mills, cotton factories, textile factories. You will begin to see the extraction of raw materials involving things like cotton and lumber, coal, seafood. All of these things are very much a part of this new Southern promise. The problem is, for all intents and purposes, the South remained a colony of the North and to a lesser extent Great Britain, right? It was still seen more or less as a natural resource sort of based economy, the same way that it was before the Civil War. It's shipping these products, things like coal, for example, to places like New York and Chicago. But you're not really seeing industrialization coming the way that many people would like to see it come. There's two primary exceptions. There's two industries, I guess you'd say, that's really going to reshape life in the South when it comes to the economy. One is going to be brought to you by a guy from Durham, North Carolina, a guy by the name of James B. Duke. And Duke is really going to be important to the tobacco industry. Now, if you've taken early American history, you know that tobacco was a huge cash crop very early in American history. And what Duke is going to do is he's going to invent an automatic cigarette rolling machine. He's going to mechanize the industry that you call tobacco. Cigarettes, cigars are a little bit different, and we'll talk about that later in the semester. But for right now, that is an industry that is going to take hold in the South, especially in places like Virginia, North Carolina, that part of the United States. The other great industry that is really going to change the game, so to speak, would be the textile industry. Okay? Now, you don't have to be a PhD in economics to get this. The South is producing the cotton, right? But up until that point, it had been shipping it 500 miles to places like Lowell, Massachusetts, for people to transform it into ready-to-consume textile. Why not build a factory right there in Gastonia, North Carolina? And in fact, that's what you begin to see happening, right? You do see the rise of a textile industry that to some extent is still very important in that region of the country. But whether we're talking about tobacco or whether we're talking about textile, it's going to be race that'll be the great divider, right? What you needed to be to get into one of these jobs was white. Jim Crow was very definitive, very, very important to Southern industry. The fact that African Americans were generally not welcome in the South's industry is important because what it is going to do is it's going to guarantee a source of cheap labor for those individuals that own the factories. Now, a couple things before I go any further. Number one, I am not saying that wages and conditions in places like Chicago were really, really high or really, really good. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, by dividing the factories based on race, what what these industrialists in the South were able to accomplish was a divided Southern workforce, right? The Southern whites were relatively grateful, but fiercely defensive of their monopoly on jobs in those factories, and they actually fought to keep African Americans out. It's not that much different than how and why Southern whites, working class whites, were fighting to keep African Americans out of their schools at the same time. It was about a level of opportunity here, right? But what is going to emanate, what is going to result from this sort of mindset is an idea of racial solidarity with the factory owners, who also happen to be white. If I'm the white factory owner and I'm giving you this job, I'm doing you this great favor, and so therefore you're going to be very grateful. You're not going to ask for things like a raise, right? The common enemy, you might say, of the working class, whether we're talking about blacks or whites, it is not each other, right? It would be the person that's pulling the strings in the factories, right? He is the person that's controlling wages and working conditions and things of that variety, but that's not going to be realized, and it will not be realized for a long, long time. And it's going to be an important part of why you see the rise of a textile industry in places like the South. You're also going to see a consequence known as urbanization. Many of these factories are going to be concentrated there in the cities, not in places like the rural countryside. And part of the reason for this is every day you see hordes and hordes of immigrants, places like Italy, places like Poland, China, sending people to the United States for opportunity, and they do tend to be concentrated in these cities. And as you're going to find out, the cities are going to be home to really this duality, extreme amounts of riches and at the same time grinding, unimaginable poverty. And collectively, what this is going to be called would be the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is generally a time period that we refer to in the late 19th century America. And it's a time period that is really defined by business owners controlling a lot of the playing cards, both politically as well, of course, as economically, right? It is a time period where you're seeing massive, massive fortunes being amassed, but you're also seeing a level of inequality that has not really been witnessed in American history up until that date, and would continue to really define the era as such, an era of institutionalized inequality. As a matter of fact, it was Mark Twain that gave it its name, the Gilded Age, naming it for its very shallow values. Now, part of the reason that life in America was the way that it was throughout the Gilded Age is because of individuals that you're looking at on the screen right there. People like John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller is what we call a monopolist, right? If you know anything about Rockefeller, it's going to be the petroleum industry, the oil industry that'll make him famous. And he's going to start an organization, a company that's going to come to be known as the Standard Oil Company. And what Standard really realizes very, very quickly is the bigger you become, the better off you are. Bigness does ensure profitability. Bigness certainly guarantees a level of competitiveness that you just aren't going to have if you remain a small mom and pop outlet. And so the goal of Standard Oil is very, very simple. Get as big as you can, as quickly as you can by buying out your competition. And everybody that doesn't want to sell, what ends up happening to those individuals is Rockefeller, because he's so big and he can afford to undersell you, charge less for his product, will basically just price you right out of the market. And when you go belly up, when your business fails, he's right there to swoop in to buy you out. But the problem is he now controls pretty much everything within the petroleum industry. What you call a situation like that would be a monopoly. And if this was an economics class, what your professor would call a monopoly would be a market failure. Because in a free market system, you need competition, right? You need producers and consumers to be competitive. Otherwise, you're going to get a market failure. What competition guarantees is the lowest possible price. It also guarantees the highest quality of the product. And when you don't have competition, it doesn't give people like Rockefeller any incentive to keep prices low, and they don't remain low. It doesn't give them any incentive to keep quality high, and sometimes it doesn't remain high. He's certainly not alone. In steel, you got Andrew Carnegie. In railroads, you got Cornelius Vanderbilt. We could go on, but for the sake of time and brevity, these individuals, these monopolists, were known as the robber barons. It's not just the economy that they're seeking to control, they also seek to control the political system as well. In a way, what these robber barons are doing is buying and selling senators, congressmen, governors, mayors, presidents of the United States. There's a deep and intricate intertwining of the corporate world as well as the American political world, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in just a second. For right now, I want to talk a little bit about the hazards of living and working in this city. Simply put, these jobs that we're talking about in these factories are dangerous. Quick example, something that you're reading. I've assigned Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and many of you are in the midst of reading that right now. If you are knee-deep in that, you know that the main character, Jurgis Rudkis, gets his big break in the factory as what is called a gut shoveler. And there's no play on words here. What he does is he shovels the entrails of slaughtered animals into this big hole in the factory floor, and then these meat grinders grind it up, churn it out, and they sell it to the American public. Not the nicest of jobs, but basically anybody can do it, right? Strong stomach, strong back, pretty much anybody can do it, including him. And one day a bull got loose on the killing floor, and it's every man for himself, and Jurgis is running for his life, and he stepped in a little hole and broke his ankle. There's no such thing as workers' compensation, right? Pretty much any time a case went to trial, the judge inevitably sided with the factory. And so this accident, which is not his fault, basically gets Jurgis fired because he can't stand on his feet for much more than about 5 minutes. He passes out from the pain, right? And so this is what I'm talking about when it comes to this institutionalized inequality. It's multifaceted and it's very nuanced. Not only is these dangerous working conditions, but there's no accountability from the level of the company, right? The idea being if you're not well enough to work, then the company can fire you and you really don't have a lot of recourse. Maybe a better way of thinking about this is there's very few paths to pursue if you happen to be working class and you happen to be injured on the job or you're done wrong in some other meaningful way. There's very little way to make yourself whole in that capacity. And so that's some of the challenges when it comes to living and working in this new world order. And let's just say this about the security of your job. If anybody can be plugged in at a day's notice, keep in mind, Jurgis got his job on the first day. If it is just plug and play, there's no way that you're ever going to get a raise. If you want a break, they're not going to give you a break. They're going to say, right there's the door, primarily because you're very easy to replace. And what that does, everybody, is that guarantees low operating costs, low labor costs for the person that owns a factory. The problem is it's not very good in terms of equality for people like Jurgis Rudkis. Um, we're talking about a time period where you're seeing not just men like Jurgis working in the factory. You see the use of child labor, and it's pretty widespread. You see the use of female labor. And again, going back to the jungle, there's a very specific reason as to why. We're talking about a time period where the government really didn't regulate industry at all, and it certainly didn't have minimum wage laws, and it didn't even say that if a man or a woman were doing the same job, that you had to pay the woman the exact same going rate that you'd pay a man. In the jungle, there is this example where um, there's a man that is put out of a job. The boss fires him, and he hires Jurgis's sister-in-law, a lady by the name of Maria. And the reason is he knows he can get away with paying Maria less because she's a woman. Same thing, same job, same quality of output. But anyway, later on in the 1930s, there's going to be a guy named Charlie Chaplin. Many of you may be familiar with that name, and he's going to produce this movie called Modern Times that will really parody a lot of the things that we're talking about here, and it'll demonstrate some of the dangers of working in factory life. Right? Probably can watch it for free if you're so inclined in an online format. But for right now, I want to end our conversation talking about the intermingling of politics with the economy. You're looking at Andrew Carnegie on the screen there if you follow along with me. And he's certainly not alone, but Carnegie made a deep venture into American politics. He didn't. What he did is basically bought and paid for the election campaigns and re-election campaigns of people of the political variety, congressmen, senators, even right up to presidents. Now understand something. People like Carnegie don't want to control the political system simply for the sake of control. All they really care about would be the parts of government that can make them wealthy, that can ensure their profitability. And so you don't want a regulatory government that'll say you can't dump this in a river, or you can't choke that out into the air, or you must pay your workers this amount of money and you got to give them a break every 4 hours. You don't want any of that because that's not very good for your bottom line. That could threaten your profitability. That's what the Carnegies of the world are worried about. In short, what they're subscribing to is a concept known as laissez-faire politics, laissez-faire economy. If you're a French scholar, you'll understand that laissez-faire generally translates into government hands off of the economy. I don't want any governmental interference in the economy whatsoever. Let business function. And if there's a problem, right, if there's not good things that are going into the meat, then the market will correct itself because people will stop buying that particular product. That company will get a bad reputation. We don't need a micromanaging government that's, is sticking its nose into business, if you will, right? Now, most people of the business variety did tend to stay out of politics, at least directly, but an even better example than Carnegie when it comes to the intersection of politics and the economy would be a guy from Montana by the name of William Clark Andrews, right? He was a industrialist that had made a lot of his money in the copper industry. The Anaconda Copper Company pretty much ran all of Montana, and Clark Andrews is a good reason why. So later on, after he had made his fortune, he decided that he wanted to go into politics. But the problem was he didn't have any experience. He didn't have anything that he could really run on. Who's going to vote for somebody that's never been in politics before? What he did have a lot of was money. And this is back when you could really demonstrate who you were voting for. Like you could physically demonstrate by walking to one end of the room who you were voting for. And Clark Andrews made it very simple. He said, anybody that votes for me, I'll pay you $10,000. And he did. He had 10 $1,000 bills that he had already made up, stuffed into envelopes, and everybody that walked to his side of the aisle when he was running for the Senate, they got an envelope that was full of $10,000. And you don't have to be, again, a PhD in political science to figure out who's going to win this election. Clark Andrews wins, and he goes to Congress. He goes to Washington in entering into the Senate, and he's immediately chastised by his senatorial colleagues. You didn't earn your way here, you bought your way here. And I think Clark Andrews' response is entirely appropriate. Really, I bought my way here. Tell me something, right? How much money from Andrew Carnegie did you take, Mr. Senator from Pennsylvania? How much money from John Rockefeller did you take, Mr. Senator from New Jersey, right? In other words, we both got here the same way. It was corporate money, right? I'm just being honest about it. I bought it, and it's bought and paid for. I'm very direct about that. You can lie to yourself if you want to, but we both know that we got to Washington in the same way. It was through political corruption. This corruption runs very, very deep, as I'm hopeful that you can see by now, and it is going to have a major impact on equality in American life. And you'll begin to see what I mean the next time I'm coming back with you. For right now, though, guys, that's where I want to leave it. I'll see you next time.